Hello everyone. This series of videos is going to be exploring Africa during the post-classical era. So we're still in period 3 here, and one of the really important things for us to acknowledge is that this is an empire that is very affected by the spread of Islam, so there's a lot of continuity left over from period 2. So, I wanted to start out just with a quote from a very famous Muslim traveler named Ibn Battuta. So after that, the chief of the poets mounts the steps of the Pempe and lays his head on the Sultan's lap, then climbs to the top of the Pempe and lays his head first on the Sultan's right shoulder, then on his left, speaking all the while in their tongue, and finally he comes down again. I was told that this practice is a very old custom amongst them, prior to the introduction of Islam, and they have kept it up. So, ultimately, what's important about this quote is that it's showing us ways in which African societies are incorporating Islam as well as their own interpretations of Sharia law into their own societies. So, again, a really important thing that we will be stressing throughout these next few videos is how the world of Islam is going to shape the culture and society and political structure of Africa. Islam's arrival in Africa did not result immediately in massive conversions, but Islam does have a significant impact on African politics, economics, and culture. And for those who convert to Islam, many long-standing cultural traditions are going to remain. And we'll go through those in more detail as we go. So Africa, before the introduction of Islam, is a very decentralized continent. The earliest migrations into sub-Saharan Africa were known as the Bantu migration. So I want to focus on those. The Bantu migrations originate in approximately 3000 BCE. Now, Bantu refers to a language-speaking group. So this language group originated in essentially present-day Mali, a little bit south of there. And what we're going to see is that as time goes on, and over a period of over 1,000 years, the Bantu-speaking people are going to migrate very far south and ultimately spread their language and culture along with them. They also brought their agricultural economy with them. They produced food surpluses. The most common crops that were grown by the Bantu-speaking people were millet and sorghum. Both of these are a very good source of carbohydrates. And they spread agricultural knowledge to the forest people that they encountered. So oftentimes when they encounter people, so let's say when the Bantu travel through the rainforest region here along the Congo River, for example, there are people that already live there. And the Bantu-speaking people are going to spread their own knowledge, their own culture, their technologies, their agricultural practices, and so they in turn are going to essentially contribute to a cultural diversion of sorts. And of course, also they will marry the people that they encounter, so there's going to be a lot of diversity and diaspora taking place along with this migration. Many Indonesian people actually are going to also be trading with the sub-Saharan Africans. So the Indonesian seafarers actually are going to bring their own agricultural products to Africa. And one of the most interesting examples of that is that the banana actually originates in Indonesia. It was brought to sub-Saharan Africa, and then it was cultivated there. So the banana was very, very good for creating a agricultural surplus. It was nutrition rich, and it actually led to a spike in population. And many Indonesian travelers and traders actually settled in Madagascar. And the language that's spoken in Madagascar today is still a blend of Austronesian languages, so it's not a Bantu language. So that's really interesting, despite the fact that the Bantu migration essentially shapes the language and culture of most of sub-Saharan Africa. Madagascar is completely unique in its language and its culture. Excuse me. Farmers increase their land for cultivation actually to grow bananas, and this again enriches diets and inspires more population growth. By 2000 BCE, the Bantu-speaking people end up reaching Lake Victoria. Lake Victoria, and this is and other Great Lakes of East Africa. And when they get there, they meet nomadic pastoral peoples and adopt the practice of raising sheep and cattle. And from there, they move southward. And by 400 CE, the Bantu speaking people reach South Africa. And that also ultimately marks the ultimate spread of the Bantu speaking people. In addition to bringing language with them, of course, they also introduced new forms of technology. So one of the reasons why the Bantu migration could take place is because the Bantu-speaking people knew how to travel along the rivers throughout sub-Saharan Africa. And they did this by canoe. And these canoes were made from hollowed-out trees, and they used those to travel up and down West Africa and Central Africa's rivers. And by 500 BCE, they also introduced their iron-making technology. And that allowed them to make more efficient tools, and it also allowed them to clear land so that they could farm more efficiently. And of course, it also allowed them to produce weapons for warfare. This technology, so their ability to use iron, gives them an edge over the people that they encounter during their migrations. And so people that they come across ultimately don't have the same sort of technological advantage to, let's say, defend themselves if they end up coming into conflict. And so the Bantu-speaking people end up defeating many local tribes in battle, and oftentimes then they absorb that population into their own. So again, the Bantu is a very diverse group of people because it's not as if it's just this small group of people that came from Mali and then populate all of sub-Saharan Africa. They basically sort of blend with the people that already live there. Another really important thing that goes along with the Bantu migration is disease ends up spreading as well. One of the most common diseases that you find in West Africa still today is malaria, which is spread by mosquitoes. The Bantu people actually have immunity because they had long-standing exposure to the malaria-carrying mosquito. But the problem was that many of the people that the Bantu came across did not have this same immunity. So as the Bantu people make their way south, in particular once they make their way into the rainforests of the Congo, the people that they come across have no immunity to malaria, and many of them end up dying off. And this is an interesting comparison, I think, to the diseases that we see in, let's say, Asia during the 1200s with the Mongol invasions. So the same stuff is happening in different parts of the world. In terms of Bantu society, one of the things that makes it stand out is that it is matrilineal, which means that the family line goes through the mother rather than the father. So that would mean that if you married, you would actually move in with your wife's family rather than the other way around. And essentially, your entire family tree was descended from your mother rather than your father. So the long-lasting nature of the Bantu migration also resulted in a variety of Bantu-speaking groups. So the language ends up evolving as time goes on. So not everyone speaks Bantu per se. People speak different dialects of it. In general, the communities among Bantu-speaking people are very close-knit. They tend to settle in small villages. Again, as I already said, they're matrilineal. And what we see is that the Bantu-speaking people made up a combination of agricultural as well as hunter-gatherer societies. And this all depended on what their environment was like. If they didn't need to have a permanent type of agriculture, they would simply resort to other means for their food. As far as religion is concerned, the Bantu people, they were not monotheistic per se. They did believe that there was one deity, but at the same time, they also believed in many other spirits. And the spirits were the people that they worshipped. They believed that it was the spirits that actually communicated messages to the god. They also believed in ancestor worship. So after a loved one died, they ended up actually sending their prayers and really praying towards this deceased family member. In a lot of ways, they wanted to sort of seek advice from their relatives beyond the grave. And this is a really important comparison to ancient China, which also practiced ancestor worship. So as far as the arts are concerned, the Bantu are very diverse in terms of the way they represent themselves in art. One of the very common features of Bantu art we see are masks and also sculpted figures. Many times they are designed to represent their dead ancestors, so we actually see that ancestor worship is manifested in the art. We also see that music is a really important part of worship and ceremony. Now, this is also a way that oral traditions were passed on from generation to generation. I wanted to just show a very brief clip of a griot, which is the name of a traditional African storyteller. So this is a really great example of oral history or oral tradition passed on from one generation to the next. I have my Bluetooth speakers hooked up, so I'm just going to turn up the volume. Let's see if we can listen to this just for a moment.
This is Kora. It's 21 strings. It's a traditional instrument from West Africa. The Gueye family is traditional musician. We take care of the history and the tradition of our ancestors.
Okay, I'm going to provide the link to that video at the description of this video so that if you want to watch more, you are welcome to. So again, it's very significant for us to realize that the way in which historical record was carried from one generation to the next was often not in writing, but through oral tradition, such as this griot that we see here. All right, next, as far as political structures are concerned, what we see is that around 1000 CE, agriculture exists in most sub-Saharan African societies, so we start to see a more complex social hierarchy develop. And so this is an important contrast, actually, to some of the other societies that we've already studied. So let's think about the period 2 empires, like Rome and the Han Dynasty, for example. The Bantu political structure tended to be much more decentralized than that. Instead, politics were organized locally. So we had kinship networks essentially structure the political development. All right, so kinship networks essentially are family groups, right? At the head of each kinship network was a chief. This was always a male, so despite the fact that we said that the societies are matrilineal, as the population increases and they become more complex, actually men gain a more important role. So despite the fact that they remain matrilineal, meaning that the descent goes through the mother, the power rests in the male members of society. So it's matrilineal but patriarchal at the same time. The chief ended up mediating conflicts between neighboring groups of people. Groups of villages were called districts. And within districts, groups of chiefs in a district would decide among themselves how to resolve a problem. So in some ways, we could see it as sort of a more decentralized federation of tribes that would work together in order to solve problems. So ultimately, tribes oftentimes would ally with each other, and if they went to war, they were going to war against another tribe. But again, there was no real such thing as modern politics. There were no political borders that were marking off one area from another. If a group was mainly a hunter-gatherer society, there was no real concept of private property per se, and so oftentimes war might be a result of that, or at the very least, maybe it was more likely in these circumstances. As the population grows, it becomes harder for kinship networks to govern. So eventually we see that there's more competition between neighbors, and that leads to more fighting among villages and districts. And eventually we're going to see larger kingdoms result from that. In particular, after about 1000 CE, we start to see much more centralized power emerge. And one of the best examples of that, I would say, would be the very hierarchical political structures that we're going to see crop up in the Congo River Basin. So I'm going to pause here because I think I've been talking for a while. We'll pick up with a second video that's looking at how Islam is going to affect the economy in Africa. So stay tuned and thanks.